A 76-year-old man with a wooden cane stepped directly into the path of a moving aircraft, and when the ground crew ran toward him screaming to get off the taxiway, he planted that cane into the asphalt like a flag and said 5 words that silenced every single one of them. "That wing is going to kill!" They laughed. They grabbed his arm, they called him confused, and then they opened the panel he was pointing at, and every mechanic on that flight line went pale. If you believe that experience should never be ignored, comment respect right now, because this story will change the way you look at every quiet old man you've ever walked past. Harold Engstrom had not slept well the night before. His left knee, the one that had been rebuilt twice since he turned 60, throbbed with a deep ache that only worsened when he tried to lie still, and so he had risen at 4 in the morning and sat in the kitchen of his small house on the outskirts of Abilene, Texas, drinking black coffee and watching the darkness beyond the window slowly give way to a grey, reluctant dawn. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier, and the house still felt too large for one person, too quiet, too full of the kind of silence that reminded him of all the conversations he would never have again. He was not a man given to self-pity. He had spent too many years on too many flight lines in too many countries to waste time feeling sorry for himself. But the mornings were hard. The mornings were always hard. Today, though, Harold had something to look forward to. The Dyess Air Force Base Heritage Air Show was happening just 20 miles east, and his grandson, Tyler, a 19-year-old college sophomore who had inherited none of Harold's mechanical aptitude, but all of his stubbornness, had promised to drive him out. Tyler arrived at 7:30 in a dusty pickup truck with a cracked windshield, and Harold climbed into the passenger seat with his cane tucked between his knees and a faded blue baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The cap had no logo on it. He had removed the insignia patch years ago when the stitching had frayed beyond repair, and he had never bothered to replace it. It was just a cap now, just something to keep the sun off his face. Tyler asked him if he was excited, and Harold said he supposed he was. Tyler asked him what planes he wanted to see, and Harold said he wanted to see whatever they had. He did not mention the T-28 Trojan that had been advertised in the airshow brochure. He did not mention that he had spent 11 years of his life maintaining T-28s at 4 different bases across 3 continents. He did not mention that the sound of a Wright R1820 radial engine was the sound that lived deepest in his memory, deeper even than Margaret's voice, deeper than the cry of his children being born, deeper than anything. Some things you did not say out loud, some things you just carried. They arrived at the airfield at 9:15. The sun was already pressing down hard, and the tarmac shimmered with heat. Crowds were gathering along the fence line near the static display area. Families with children on their shoulders, veterans in unit caps and embroidered jackets, photographers with long lenses angled toward the sky. Tyler found a parking spot in a grass lot 1/4 mile from the main gate, and Harold stepped out slowly, steadying himself on the cane before beginning the long walk toward the entrance. His pace was deliberate, not slow exactly, but careful, the way a man walks when he knows his body has become something that requires management rather than trust. Tyler walked beside him, matching his speed without comment, which Harold appreciated. The boy had that much sense at least. Inside the perimeter the noise was enormous. A pair of T-6 Texans were already in the air, their engines buzzing in formation passes that drew cheers from the crowd. On the ground a row of warbirds sat gleaming in the sun, a P-51 Mustang with invasion stripes, a Corsair with its distinctive gull wing, a Grumman Bearcat painted in navy blue, and there, at the far end of the line, partially obscured by a fuel truck and a cluster of ground crew in orange vests, sat the T-28 Trojan. Harold saw it and stopped walking. He did not say anything. He just stood there in the middle of the pathway with people flowing around him like water around a stone, and he looked at that airplane the way a man looks at a photograph of someone he loved who has been gone a very long time. The paint scheme was Korean War era, Navy Training Command, glossy orange and white with black lettering on the fuselage. The propeller was polished to a mirror finish. The canopy was open, and he could see the rear instructor's seat where a crew chief would sometimes ride during maintenance check flights, bracing against the stick with one hand while scanning the instrument panel with practiced eyes. Harold had ridden in that seat more times than he could count. He had smelled the hydraulic fluid and the exhaust fumes and the leather of the harness straps and the peculiar metallic scent of an aircraft that was alive, that was breathing, that was ready to climb. Tyler touched his arm. "Grandpa, you okay?" Harold blinked. "Fine," he said. "Just looking." They moved closer to the static display area, and Harold leaned against the rope barrier and studied the T-28 with the quiet intensity of a man reading a letter written in a language only he could still speak. His eyes moved across the aircraft with a precision that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with 30 years of professional habit. He looked at the landing gear struts and noted the slight asymmetry in the oleo compression. He looked at the exhaust stacks and saw residue patterns consistent with a rich fuel mixture. He looked at the propeller hub and the spinner and the cowl flaps and the wing root fairings, and something in his chest tightened. Not emotion. Something else. Something mechanical. Something wrong. He did not say anything yet. He shifted his weight on the cane and squinted against the glare, and looked again at the left wing root, at the point where the wing spar entered the fuselage through the carry-through structure. There was a shimmer there. Not a reflection from the paint. Not a trick of the heat. A shimmer in the metal itself, a faint distortion along the panel line that most people would never notice in 1,000 years, but that Harold Engstrom had been trained to see before he could legally drink a beer. It was a stress indicator. It meant that something beneath that panel was not sitting the way it was supposed to sit. It meant that a structural member, likely a spar attachment bolt or a fitting, had shifted under load and was transmitting that shift to the skin of the aircraft in a way that was almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look and exactly what you were looking for. Harold knew both. He turned to Tyler. "Stay here," he said. Tyler frowned. "Where are you going?" Harold did not answer. He was already walking toward the crew area beyond the rope line, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the concrete, his jaw set in an expression that Tyler had seen only a handful of times in his life and had learned never to argue with. The ground crew chief for the T-28 was a man named Brian Kessler, 42 years old, owner of a warbird restoration shop in Midland and a licensed A&P mechanic with an inspection authorization. Brian had spent 14 months restoring this particular T-28C from a derelict hulk found in a barn in Arkansas, and he was proud of the work, justifiably so. The engine had been overhauled by a certified radial engine shop in Oregon. The airframe had been inspected, repaired, and reskinned where necessary. The aircraft had passed its annual inspection and had received a special flight permit for the airshow demonstration. Brian had personally signed off on the pre-flight that morning, and he had watched his pilot, a retired Navy commander named Dave Stovall, climb into the cockpit 20 minutes ago and begin the engine start sequence. The big right radial had coughed and belched a cloud of blue smoke and then settled into a deep, resonant idle that vibrated through the ground and into the soles of Brian's boots, and he had felt the satisfaction that every mechanic feels when an engine he rebuilt comes to life and runs clean. He was standing near the wingtip watching the prop wash flatten the grass beyond the taxiway when he saw the old man duck under the rope barrier and start walking directly toward the aircraft. Brian raised his hand immediately. Sir, you can't be out here. This is a restricted area." The old man kept walking. His cane struck the ground with each step like a metronome, and his eyes were fixed on the left side of the fuselage with an intensity that Brian found unsettling. "Sir, I need you to stop right now. This aircraft is about to taxi." Harold stopped. Not because Brian had told him to, but because he had reached the spot he needed to reach. He was standing approximately 10 feet from the left wing route, and from this distance, with the sun at the angle it was at, the shimmer was unmistakable. He pointed at it with the tip of his cane. "You've got a problem," he said. Brian walked toward him with the controlled urgency of a man who deals with unauthorized civilians, wandering into dangerous areas more often than he would like. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this aircraft has been fully inspected and cleared for flight. I need you to step back behind the rope line immediately." Harold did not move. "Pull the panel," he said. His voice was not loud, it was not aggressive. It carried the flat, unquestioning authority of a man who had issued 10,000 directives on 10,000 flight lines, and had never once been wrong about a structural anomaly. "Left wing root access panel. Pull it and look at the forward spar bolt." Brian's expression shifted from patient professionalism to something harder. "Sir, I'm a licensed mechanic. I did the pre-flight myself this morning. The aircraft is airworthy, and I need you to clear the area before someone gets hurt." He reached for Harold's arm, intending to guide him back toward the spectator area, and Harold pulled his arm away with a sharpness that surprised both of them. "Son," Harold said, and the word landed like a stone dropped into still water. I am not confused, I am not lost, and I am not leaving this spot until you pull that panel." Behind them, the T-28's engine note changed as Dave Stovall advanced the throttle slightly, preparing to release the brakes and begin taxiing toward the active runway. The prop blast intensified, and Harold's cap nearly blew off his head. He caught it with his free hand and jammed it back down and stood his ground, his cane planted between his feet like a third leg, immovable. Brian looked at the old man and saw what most people saw when they looked at Harold Engstrom. An elderly civilian with bad knees and a cheap cap and clothes that had been washed too many times. A spectator who had wandered into the wrong area, probably a veteran with a sentimental attachment to old airplanes, possibly experiencing some age-related confusion. Brian was not a cruel man. He was not dismissive by nature, but he had a pilot in the cockpit, an airshow schedule to keep, and a crowd of 3,000 people waiting for the T-28 demonstration, and he did not have time to indulge an old man's unsubstantiated claim about an aircraft that Brian himself had rebuilt from the rivets up. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to clear the area. If you don't, I'm going to have to call security." Harold looked at him. His eyes were a washed-out blue, the colour of sky seen through very old glass, and there was something in them that Brian would later describe to his wife as the most unsettling calm he had ever encountered. "Call whoever you want," Harold said, "but I'm telling you right now, if that airplane leaves the ground, the left wing is coming off before he reaches pattern altitude. That spar bolt has shifted. I can see it in the skin. Pull the panel or you're going to kill your pilot." Brian stared at him. The engine was rumbling behind them. Dave Stovall's voice crackled over the handheld radio clipped to Brian's belt, asking if the taxiway was clear. A member of the ground crew, a younger man named Ruiz, jogged over and said, "Brian, we've got an unauthorized person on the taxiway. Want me to call the base police?" Brian held up his hand. Something in the old man's voice had caught him. Not the content of the words, which Brian still believed were almost certainly wrong, but the delivery, the absolute absence of doubt. Brian had been around aviation long enough to know that genuine experts did not hedge. They did not qualify. They stated facts the way this old man was stating facts, with the certainty of someone who had seen the failure mode before and recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a disease he has treated 100 times. "Who are you?" Brian asked. Harold met his eyes. "My name is Harold Engstrom, Staff Sergeant, United States Air Force, retired. Crew Chief, Flight Line Maintenance, 1966 to 1996. I maintained T-28s at Randolph, Keesler, Shepard, and Clark. I have more hours on the T-28 airframe than any pilot in this country has in a logbook, and I am telling you, as a professional courtesy from one mechanic to another, that the forward spar attachment bolt on that left wing has shifted and the skin is showing stress deformation consistent with a fatigue crack in the bolt or the fitting. Pull the panel, it will take you 8 minutes. That is all I am asking." The air around them seemed to contract. Ruiz, who had been reaching for his radio, lowered his hand. Brian looked at Harold for a long moment, then looked at the left wing route, then looked back at Harold. The engine idled. The crowd murmured behind the fence line. The sun beat down on all of them with indifferent intensity. Brian keyed his radio. "Dave, hold position. We've got a ground hold. Do not taxi. Repeat, do not taxi." There was a pause, then Dave's voice came back, clipped and professional. "Copy, holding position. What's the issue?" Brian looked at Harold. "We're pulling a panel," he said into the radio. "Give me 10 minutes. He turned to Ruiz. "Get me a number 2 Phillips and a flashlight, and get Martinez over here." Ruiz jogged away. Brian turned back to Harold and said, "If there's nothing there, you're going to owe me the biggest apology of your life." Harold said nothing. He simply stepped back 3 paces, leaned on his cane, and watched. What happened next would later be described by Brian Kessler as the worst 5 minutes of his professional career. Ruiz returned with the tools and a second mechanic named Carlos Martinez, who had 20 years of airframe experience and had helped Brian with the restoration. Brian knelt beneath the left wing and began removing the screws from the wing root access panel, 12 quarter-turn fasteners that he had installed himself and that came out cleanly, one after another, with the practiced rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He pulled the panel free and set it on the ground and shone the flashlight into the cavity, and for a moment he saw nothing unusual. The spar carry-through structure looked normal. The fittings looked clean. The bolt heads were visible, seated flush against their washers, torqued to specification, exactly as he had left them 14 months ago. and then he moved the flashlight half an inch to the left, and he saw it. The forward spar attachment bolt on the left side, a high-strength AN bolt rated for the full aerobatic load spectrum of the T-28 airframe, had developed a circumferential fatigue crack approximately 1/3 of the way through its shank. The crack was not visible to the naked eye from the outside. It was hidden beneath the bolt head, in the transition zone between the shank and the head fillet, exactly where cyclical loading concentrates stress in a fastener that has been subjected to repeated vibration over an extended period. But the crack had caused the bolt to elongate microscopically, which had allowed the spar fitting to shift by less than a 32nd of an inch, which had transmitted a barely perceptible stress ripple through the wing skin at the root fairing, which had produced the shimmer that Harold Engstrom had seen from 50 yards away, while leaning on a rope barrier with a bad knee and a wooden cane. Brian stared at the cracked bolt for a long time. He did not move. He did not speak. Martinez leaned in beside him, saw it, and whispered something in Spanish that Brian did not catch. Then Brian backed out from under the wing and stood up and looked at Harold, and his face had changed completely. The professional skepticism was gone. The impatience was gone. What was left was something raw and unguarded, something that looked very much like fear retroactively applied to a disaster that had not happened, but easily could have. "My God," Brian said. His voice was barely above a whisper. He was 20 seconds from taxiing to the runway. Harold nodded once. "I know." Brian ran his hand over his face and took a breath that shuddered on the way in. At full demonstration power, pulling 4 Gs in a wing over, that bolt would have failed catastrophically. The wing spar would have separated from the fuselage, the wing would have folded. At 300 feet, maybe 400, there's no recovery from that. Dave would be dead. Harold nodded again. "I know." There was a silence between them that was not empty but full, dense with the weight of what had almost happened, and the incomprehensible precision of what had prevented it. Brian looked at this old man, this retired crew chief with his worn cane and his faded cap and his quiet, unyielding certainty, and something broke open in his chest that he was not prepared for. His eyes reddened. His throat tightened. He extended his hand, and when Harold took it, Brian held on with both hands and did not let go for a long time. "How did you see it?" Brian asked. His voice was hoarse. From behind the rope line, 50 yards away, "How the hell did you see it?" Harold looked at the wing and then looked back at Brian. "You spend 30 years looking at the same airframe. You learn what it's supposed to look like. When it doesn't look right, you see it. You don't think about it. You don't analyze it. You just see it. The skin was talking, and I know the language." Brian shook his head slowly. "I rebuilt that airplane from nothing. I inspected every fitting, every bolt, every rivet. I signed it off. I was sure." Harold's expression softened for the first time. "You did good work, son. That's a beautiful restoration. But fatigue doesn't care about good work. Fatigue doesn't care about inspections. It happens on its own schedule in its own time, and the only thing that catches it is eyes that have seen it before. You'll see it next time. Now you know what to look for." By this time, a small crowd had gathered near the wing, drawn by the ground hold and the visible commotion. Ruiz had told a few people what was happening, and the news was spreading the way news spreads at air shows, quickly and with increasing embellishment. Dave Stovall had shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit and was now standing beneath the wing, staring at the cracked bolt with the expression of a man who was looking at his own death and watching it recede backward through time like a wave pulling away from shore. He was quiet for a long time. Then he walked over to Harold and stood in front of him and said nothing for several seconds. "You saved my life," Dave said finally. Harold shook his head. "I just did what I was trained to do." Dave, a retired Navy commander who had flown combat missions over Iraq and had never been a man given to public displays of emotion, put his hand on Harold's shoulder and squeezed, and his eyes were bright with something he did not try to hide. Word reached the Airshow Operations Center within minutes. The show director, a retired Air Force colonel named Patricia Webb, came out to the flight line personally, accompanied by 2 members of the Base Safety Office and a Federal Aviation Administration inspector who happened to be on site for the event. They examined the bolt, they examined the panel, they spoke to Brian and to Dave, and then they spoke to Harold. And when Harold gave his name and his service history, Patricia Webb's expression changed in a way that told Harold she understood exactly what she was dealing with. She was a maintenance officer by background. She had come up through the logistics pipeline at Air Training Command in the 1980s, and she knew what a 30-year crew chief was. She knew what that kind of experience meant. She knew that there were men and women who had spent their entire careers keeping aircraft in the air by the sheer force of their attention, their discipline, and their refusal to let anything slide, and that those men and women were disappearing one by one as they aged and retired and died, taking with them a body of knowledge that no manual could capture and no computer could replicate. She asked Harold to sit down. He said he was fine standing. She asked him if he needed water. He said he could use some. A young airman brought him a bottle and Harold drank from it and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and waited. Patricia looked at him for a moment and then said, "Mr. Engstrom, I've been running air shows for 12 years, and I have never seen anything like what you just did. You spotted a critical structural failure from the spectator area with nothing but your eyes. You refused to be dismissed. You held your ground against a professional maintenance team that had cleared the aircraft for flight. And you were right. You were absolutely, unequivocally right. And if you had not been here today, or if you had not had the courage to step onto that taxiway, Commander Stovall would almost certainly be dead, and 3,000 spectators would have witnessed it." Harold looked at her steadily. "I didn't do anything special, Ma'am. I just looked at the airplane." Patricia shook her head. "No, you looked at the airplane the way no one else here could. That's not nothing. That's everything." The FAA inspector, a man named Garza, was less poetic but no less impressed. He took Harold's statement formally, recording his observations and his reasoning in precise technical language that Harold provided with the fluency of a man reciting something he had known his entire adult life. The forward spar bolt, AN6-12A, installed in position LP-4 on the wing carry-through structure, had sustained a fatigue crack originating at the head-to-shank radius, propagating circumferentially through approximately 35% of the bolt cross-section. The failure mechanism was consistent with high cycle fatigue accelerated by resonant vibration from the Wright R1820 engine at cruise power settings, compounded by the cyclical loading inherent in the aerobatic flight profile of the demonstration routine. The bolt had likely been compromised for several flight cycles, but had not yet reached the critical crack length that would cause immediate failure under normal loads. Under the 4G aerobatic loading planned for the demonstration, however, the remaining cross-section would have been insufficient to carry the spar reaction load, and catastrophic structural failure of the left wing would have been virtually certain. Garza looked up from his notes and said, "You diagnosed all of this from a visual observation of skin deformation at 50 yards. Harold said, "Yes, sir." Garza said, "That's the most impressive piece of preventive maintenance I've ever documented." Harold said, "Thank you, sir," and shifted his weight on his cane, and that was all he said about it. The T-28 was immediately grounded. Brian Kessler, shaken but resolute, began a complete reinspection of every structural fastener in the airframe, a process that would take weeks. He told Harold that he was going to implement a spar bolt inspection protocol based on Harold's observations. A bore scope inspection of all critical fasteners at 50-hour intervals, which exceeded the manufacturer's recommendations but which Brian now considered the absolute minimum. Harold listened and nodded, and offered a few suggestions about inspection techniques and lighting angles that Brian wrote down in his pocket notebook, with the careful handwriting of a man who understood that he was recording something valuable. Tyler, who had been standing at the rope line watching all of this unfold with the wide-eyed bewilderment of a 19-year-old who had just learned that his grandfather was not simply an old man who drank black coffee and watched the sunrise, pushed through the crowd and found Harold sitting on a folding chair near the maintenance tent, drinking his second bottle of water. "Grandpa," Tyler said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Harold looked at him. "Tell you what?" Tyler gestured vaguely at the airplane, the crew, the officials, the entire scene of controlled chaos that Harold had single-handedly created. "Any of this. What you did. What you know. Who you are." Harold was quiet for a moment. He looked at the T-28, sitting silent now with its cowling removed and its wing panel open like a patient on an operating table, and he said, "Tyler, I spent 30 years making sure pilots came home alive. That was my job. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody pinned medals on crew chiefs. Nobody wrote stories about us. We just did the work and we did it right and the planes flew and the pilots came home, and that was enough. It was always enough." Tyler sat down next to him and did not say anything, and they sat there together in the shade of the maintenance tent while the air show continued around them, the sound of engines overhead and the cheering of crowds, and Harold listened to all of it with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his whole life listening to machines and had never once stopped. Later that afternoon, Patricia Webb found Harold again. She told him that the airshow committee wanted to recognize him publicly during the closing ceremony. Harold said that was not necessary. Patricia said she understood, but she hoped he would reconsider, because what he had done deserved to be seen and acknowledged, not for his sake, but for the sake of every crew chief and maintenance professional who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten. Harold looked at her for a long time, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something old and tired and deeply buried that had been waiting a very long time to be spoken to. He said, "All right." At 5 o'clock that evening, as the sun dropped toward the western horizon and painted the sky above the airfield in shades of amber and red, Harold Engstrom walked slowly to the center of the main stage in front of 3,000 people. He used his cane, he wore his faded cap. He looked exactly like what he was, an old man who had spent his life in service to something larger than himself and had asked for nothing in return. Patricia Webb stood at the microphone and told the crowd what had happened that morning. She told them about the bolt, she told them about the wing, she told them about the man who had seen what no one else could see and who had refused to be silenced until the truth was heard. And then she said, "Staff Sergeant Harold Engstrom, United States Air Force, served 30 years on the flight line keeping our aircraft and our pilots safe. Today, he did it one more time, and I think it's time we told him what we should have been telling men and women like him for a very long time. Thank you for your service, thank you for your eyes, thank you for not walking away." The crowd rose. 3,000 people stood up from their lawn chairs and their blankets and their bleacher seats, and the sound they made was not a cheer exactly, but something deeper, something that came from the chest rather than the throat, a sustained roar of recognition that rolled across the airfield like thunder. Harold stood at the center of it with his cane in his right hand and his cap in his left, and he did not wave, and he did not smile, and he did not cry, but his chin trembled once, just once, and that was enough to tell anyone who was watching that he had heard them and that it mattered. Dave Stovall climbed the stage and saluted him. A full, crisp, textbook salute from a retired Navy commander to an Air Force staff sergeant, which in the rigid world of military protocol was not standard practice, but which in the larger world of men who owe their lives to other men was the most natural thing in the world. Harold straightened. His shoulders went back. His spine aligned in a way it had not aligned in years, and he returned the salute with a precision that 30 years of retirement had not dulled by a single degree. Brian Kessler was in the crowd. He was standing near the back with his arms folded across his chest and tears running down his face that he did not bother to wipe away. Ruiz was next to him, and Martinez, and they were all watching the old man on the stage, and they were all thinking the same thing, that they had almost dismissed him, that they had almost called security, that they had almost let a man die because they could not see past the cane and the cap and the age to the 30 years of mastery that stood behind them. Brian would go home that night and sit in his garage and look at his tools and think about what it meant to be a mechanic, what it really meant, not the certificates and the licenses and the sign-offs, but the eyes, the instinct, the sacred obligation to see what others cannot and to speak when others will not. He would think about Harold Engstrom for the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the warbird community like a signal fire. Aviation forums picked it up. Maintenance publications ran articles about fatigue crack detection and the irreplaceable value of experienced visual inspection. Brian Kessler published a detailed technical bulletin describing the failure mode and crediting Harold's observation, and the bulletin was downloaded over 12,000 times in its first month. The Experimental Aircraft Association invited Harold to speak at their annual convention, and Harold declined, saying he was not a speaker. They invited him again, and he declined again. They invited him a third time, and Tyler told him he should go, and Margaret's voice, the one Harold still heard in the quiet mornings, seemed to agree, and so Harold went. He stood in front of 800 people in a convention hall in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and he talked about T-28s. He talked about bolt patterns and stress risers, and the way metal speaks to you if you're willing to listen. He talked for 45 minutes without notes, and when he finished, the audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted so long that Harold finally raised his hand and said, "All right, that's enough. I've got a flight to catch." The room laughed, and then they cheered again, and Harold walked off the stage with his cane tapping against the floor and his cap pulled low and the ghost of a smile on his face that he would deny if anyone asked. Dave Stovall wrote Harold a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, just a navy anchor embossed on the back flap. Inside, on a single sheet of paper, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, Dave had written, "Harold, I have flown in combat. I have faced anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles. I have ejected from a burning aircraft over open water, but the closest I ever came to dying was on a sunny day in Texas when I was 20 seconds from taxiing a beautiful airplane with a broken wing to the runway. You stood on that taxiway with nothing but a cane and 30 years of knowledge, and you saved my life. I do not have the words to tell you what that means. I will spend the rest of my life trying to find them. Your friend, Dave." Harold read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer of his nightstand next to Margaret's wedding ring and a photograph of his crew from Clark Air Base, 1979. He did not show it to anyone. Some things were not for showing, some things were just for knowing. The T-28 flew again 6 months later, with a new set of spar bolts and a reinforced inspection protocol and a small decal on the left-wing root that read, "Engstrom Inspected." Brian Kessler had put it there himself, hand-painted in white letters on a dark blue background, and when Harold saw it for the first time at the next year's airshow, he stood in front of that wing and looked at those letters and did not say a word for a very long time. Tyler stood beside him, and this time Tyler did not ask if he was okay, because Tyler understood now, in a way he had not understood before, that his grandfather's silence was not emptiness, but fullness, not absence but presence, the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent doing work that mattered in ways that most people would never see. Harold Engstrom went back to his house in Abilene. He drank his black coffee in the mornings and watched the sunrise and listened to the silence that was no longer quite so silent, because now it contained something new, not noise, not activity, just the quiet knowledge that he had been seen, that after 30 years of invisible service someone had finally looked at him the way he looked at airplanes, with attention and respect, and the understanding that what seems ordinary on the surface can carry something extraordinary within. He was 76 years old, his knees ached, his wife was gone, his cap was faded, and he had saved a man's life with nothing but his eyes and the stubbornness to use them, and that was not a bad thing to have done on a Tuesday morning in Texas. The next time you see an old man with a cane and a faded cap, walking slowly through a place where no one seems to notice him, remember this story. Remember that silence is not emptiness. Remember that age is not irrelevance. Remember that behind every quiet exterior, there may be 30 years of mastery, a lifetime of service, and a pair of eyes that can see what the rest of us cannot. And remember that when that man speaks, the wisest thing you can do is listen. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel, because we believe that respect is not given to titles or uniforms, it is earned by those who serve quietly and never stop watching over the rest of us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today.